August 12, 1944. The air above Normandy hung thick with diesel fumes, and dust so fine it coated your teeth when you breathed. Private First Class James Jimmy Birdsong stood beside his 2.5-ton GMC truck, hands blackened with grease, staring down a road that seemed to stretch forever. The convoy behind him looked like a mechanical river, 400 trucks painted olive drab, each one loaded with ammunition, gasoline, rations, medical supplies, everything an army needs to keep pushing east, everything except rest. Jimmy wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his wrist. His uniform stuck to his skin. The sun beat down on the French countryside like a hammer on an anvil, turning the canvas covering his cargo into an oven. Behind him, Corporal Marcus Webb leaned against the truck's fender, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "You gonna stare at that road all day, or we gonna drive it?" Marcus asked, his Alabama drawl cutting through the engine noise around them. Jimmy didn't answer immediately. He was 23 years old, a mechanic from Tuskegee who'd enlisted thinking he'd work on planes. Instead, they'd handed him a steering wheel and told him the war depended on him keeping it between the ditches. For 16 hours a day, every day, without headlights after dark, without stopping for anything but breakdowns and German fighters. "Just wondering how far Paris is," Jimmy finally said. 350 miles, give or take." That was Sergeant William Hayes, walking down the line of trucks, clipboard in hand, his boots crunching on gravel. Hayes was 37, old enough to be Jimmy's father, with gray creeping into his temples and a scar across his left cheek from a bar fight in Chicago years before the war. "And we're gonna cover it in 72 hours, rain or shine, Luftwaffe or no Luftwaffe." Jimmy felt his stomach tighten. 350 miles in 3 days. On roads the Germans had bombed. Through territory still crawling with Wehrmacht stragglers. Past French villages where civilians stared at them like they were ghosts. "Sarge, the brakes on number 47 are soft," Jimmy said. "I told Motorpool yesterday, but doesn't matter now." Hayes didn't look up from his clipboard. "Patton's Third Army is 60 miles past the fuel we gave them yesterday. They're running on fumes. If we don't get 500 tons of gasoline to them by Tuesday, they stop. And if Patton stops, the Germans get time to dig in." "You understand what I'm telling you, Birdsong?" Jimmy understood. He'd understood since they'd briefed them a week ago in a muddy field outside Saint-Lô. The Allies had broken out of Normandy. The German army was in retreat. But an army in motion eats fuel and ammunition faster than factories can make it. And the ports, Cherbourg, the artificial harbors at the beaches, were still 300 miles behind the front lines. Someone had to bridge that gap. Someone had to keep the supplies moving. That someone was them. The Red Ball Express, they called it. A name borrowed from American railroads, where a red ball on the side of a boxcar meant priority freight. Except there were no rails here, just 2 lanes of cratered French highway, marked with red balls painted on signs every few miles, reserved exclusively for military trucks heading east. "Mount up," Hayes shouted down the line. "We roll in 5." Jimmy climbed into his cab. The seat was torn, springs poking through the fabric. The steering wheel was worn smooth where thousands of hands had gripped it before his. He turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. Marcus swung up into the passenger seat, tossing his cigarette out the window. "Another day, another dollar," he muttered. "We don't get paid for this," Jimmy said. Marcus grinned. "Hell, Jimmy, we get paid $30 a month. That's about 2 cents an hour once you factor in that we never sleep." The truck ahead of them lurched forward. Jimmy eased off the clutch, felt the weight of 2 tons of ammunition settle as the truck began to roll. The convoy moved like a single organism, each vehicle following the exhaust cloud of the one in front. They passed a burned-out Panzer tank in a ditch, its turret blown clean off. A week ago, that might have made Jimmy nervous. Now he barely glanced at it. Dead tanks were just road furniture. What made him nervous was the sound of his own engine. A slight knock in the third cylinder. a rattle in the transmission when he shifted into fourth. This truck had been driven hard since D-Day, and it showed. But there were no replacements, no spare vehicles. You drove what you had until it quit, and then you fixed it on the side of the road while the convoy rolled past. "Think we'll make it to Paris?" Marcus asked, lighting another cigarette. "We made it yesterday," Jimmy said. "We'll make it today." But yesterday they had daylight. Today they'd be driving into the night. And that was when the real fear started, navigating bombed-out roads in total blackness. Nothing but the faint glow of the truck ahead to follow, one hand on the wheel and one foot ready to slam the brakes if the convoy stopped without warning. The road ahead shimmered in the heat. Somewhere up there, beyond the horizon, American tanks were waiting for fuel, waiting for bullets, waiting for men like Jimmy Birdsong to keep the machinery of war turning. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel and pressed the accelerator. The longest road in France stretched out before him, and there was no turning back. 16 hours later, the sun was gone. Jimmy's eyes burned. His back ached from the constant vibration of the road. His right leg cramped from holding the accelerator steady at 30 miles per hour, the maximum safe speed for a convoy at night without headlights. Without headlights. That was the rule. German fighters patrolled the roads after dark, hunting for targets. A line of glowing headlights stretching for miles would be a gift, so they drove blind. Each driver followed the faint silhouette of the truck ahead, guided only by a sliver of moonlight and instinct. Jimmy blinked hard, trying to clear the grit from his vision. His hands were locked on the wheel, knuckles white. Beside him, Marcus had fallen asleep with his head against the window, mouth open, snoring softly over the engine noise. Lucky bastard, Jimmy thought. The road had narrowed, trees pressed in from both sides, their branches forming a tunnel overhead that blotted out even the starlight. Jimmy leaned forward, squinting into the darkness. 20 feet ahead, the red taillights of Sergeant Hayes's truck glowed like dying embers. He focused on those lights. They were the only thing keeping him from driving into a ditch or a shell crater or the back of another truck. Then they vanished. Jimmy's heart lurched. He eased off the accelerator, straining to see. Had Hayes stopped? Turned? The convoy protocol was clear. If you lose sight of the vehicle ahead, stop immediately and wait for signals. But stopping meant losing time, and losing time meant men dying somewhere up ahead for lack of ammunition. Jimmy made a choice. He kept rolling, slower now, 5 miles per hour, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. There. A shape materialized on the right side of the road. Hayes's truck pulled over at an angle, hood up. Jimmy's stomach sank. Breakdown. He pulled alongside and killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. Marcus jerked awake. "We stopped?" "Hayes broke down," Jimmy said, already climbing out. The night air was cold after the heat of the cab. Jimmy grabbed a flashlight from the toolbox bolted to the truck's side red lens so it wouldn't show from the air, and jogged forward. Hayes was elbow-deep in the engine compartment, cursing under his breath. Steam hissed from the radiator. "The hose blew," Hayes said without looking. "Pry up. Coolant's all over the road." Jimmy aimed his flashlight into the engine bay. The rubber hose connecting the radiator to the engine block had split clean through, spraying boiling water across the manifold. "I've got a spare," Jimmy said. "How long will it take to replace it?" Jimmy calculated. "Remove the clamps, drain the remaining coolant, install the new hose, refill the system. 20 minutes. Maybe 30. Hayes checked his watch. "Do it at 15. Every minute we're stopped is another mile. Patton's boys run on empty." Jimmy didn't argue. He ran back to his truck, yanked open the toolbox, and grabbed a coil of spare radiator hose and a hacksaw. Marcus appeared on his shoulder. "I'll get the water cans," Marcus said. They worked in near darkness. Jimmy sawing through the damaged hose while Marcus held the flashlight. The rubber was stiff and hot, fighting the blade. Sweat dripped into Jimmy's eyes. His hands shook from exhaustion and adrenaline. Behind them, the convoy had stopped. 400 trucks sitting silent in the French night, waiting for one hose to be replaced. "Faster, Birdsong," Hayes called from the cab. Jimmy's fingers moved on muscle memory. Loosen the clamp. Pull the old hose. Measure the new one. Cut. Install. Tighten. His father had taught him this in their garage back in Alabama, working on tractors and delivery trucks for the white farmers who wouldn't hire a black man for anything but repairs. His father's voice echoed in his head. "Slow is smooth. Smooth is fast." "Done," Jimmy said, stepping back. Marcus poured water into the radiator from a jerry can. Steam rose in the cold air. Hayes turned the engine over. It coughed once, then caught. "Good work," Hayes said. "Now get back in your truck and let's move." Jimmy was already running. He threw the tools into the box, slammed it shut, and climbed into the cab. The engine fired on the first try. Thank God. The convoy rolled forward again, a mechanical dragon stirring from sleep. But Jimmy's hands were shaking now. Not from work, from something else. They'd been stopped for 18 minutes, exposed, vulnerable, and somewhere above them, in the dark French sky, German pilots might be circling, listening for the sound of engines. He pressed the accelerator and followed the red glow of Hayes's taillights back into the tunnel of trees. 10 miles later, they heard it. A high, thin whine cutting through the engine noise, growing louder. "Plane," Marcus said, suddenly awake, staring up through the windshield. "Get down," Jimmy hissed. The whine became a roar. The convoy ahead began to scatter drivers, yanking their trucks off the road, killing engines, diving for cover. Jimmy cranked the wheel hard right. The truck lurched off the pavement and into a ditch, tilting at a sickening angle. He killed the engine and dropped below the dashboard, pulling Marcus down with him. The roar passed overhead. Close. Too close. Jimmy could hear the rattle of the aircraft's machine guns, even though they weren't firing yet. The pilot was looking for targets. Looking for lights. "Don't move," Jimmy whispered. The roar faded, circled, came back. This time the machine guns opened up. The sound was like cloth tearing, rapid and vicious. Tracers lit up the sky, bright orange streaks cutting through the darkness, stitching across the road 50 yards ahead. A truck exploded in a ball of flame, ammunition cooking off in secondary detonations. Jimmy pressed his face against the floorboard, hands over his head, praying to a God he wasn't sure was listening. The plane made 3 passes, 3 trucks burning by the time it finally flew away, the whine of its engine fading into the night. Silence fell, then voices, shouting, screaming. Jimmy lifted his head. Marcus was staring at him, eyes wide, face pale in the orange glow of the fires. "We good?" Marcus asked. Jimmy nodded, though he didn't feel good. He felt like his heart was trying to punch through his ribs. They climbed out of the truck. Other drivers were emerging from ditches, from behind trees, from under their vehicles. Sergeant Hayes was already organizing a fire brigade, men with extinguishers and shovels trying to contain the burning fuel. 3 trucks were lost, 16 tons of supplies are gone, 2 drivers were wounded, and they were still 100 miles from Paris. Jimmy walked back to his truck, hands in his pockets, staring at the flames. This was the 3rd air attack he'd survived in 2 weeks. How many more would there be? How long could his luck hold? "Mount up," Hayes shouted. "We keep moving," because that was the only option. Keep moving or let the war grind to a halt. Jimmy climbed back into his cab, started the engine, pulled the truck out of the ditch, and followed the ghosts on the highway deeper into the night. August 14th, 72 hours into the run. Jimmy hadn't slept in 3 days. Oh, he'd closed his eyes a few times, 15-minute catnaps, while mechanics refueled his truck at supply depots, his head lolling against the steering wheel, dreaming of nothing. But real sleep, the kind that lets your mind rest, that lets your body heal? He couldn't remember the last time. The convoy had reached the outskirts of Chartres, 60 miles southwest of Paris. They were close now. So close Jimmy could almost smell the end of this run. Almost. But his truck was dying. The knock in the engine had become a grinding scream. The transmission slipped between third and fourth gear, forcing him to double clutch every shift. The brakes, those soft brakes, he'd warned the motor pool about 3 days ago now, required him to pump the pedal 4 times just to slow down. "This thing's not gonna make it," Marcus said, stating the obvious. Jimmy didn't answer. His jaw was clenched so tight his teeth ached. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel, everything outside the road ahead fading into gray static. He'd seen other drivers like this, the 1,000-yard stare, the white-knuckle grip, the refusal to speak unless spoken to. They called it the breaking point. He was there now. The convoy slowed. Ahead, Hayes's brake lights glowed red. The line of trucks compressed like an accordion, each vehicle creeping forward until they came to a complete stop. Jimmy set the handbrake and exhaled. His hands were trembling. He opened the door and stepped down onto the road, legs wobbling beneath him. "What's the holdup?" Marcus called from the cab. "Don't know. Stay put." Jimmy walked forward, past trucks idling in the August heat, past drivers slumped over steering wheels, past men who looked as dead as he felt. He found Hayes standing in the middle of the road, hands on his hips, staring at something ahead. A bridge, or what was left of one. The Germans had blown it during their retreat, collapsed the center span into the river below, leaving nothing but twisted steel and broken concrete. The water underneath was shallow, maybe 3 feet deep, but the banks were steep and muddy. "Can we ford it?" Jimmy asked. Hayes shook his head. "Too soft. Trucks would bog down. We'd lose half the convoy trying." "So what do we do?" Hayes looked at his map, fingers tracing roads. "There's another bridge, 10 miles north. But that'll add 2 hours to the run. Maybe 3. 2 hours. Jimmy felt something crack inside him. 2 more hours without sleep. 2 more hours pushing a dying truck. 2 more hours closer to the moment when his hand slipped on the wheel and he drove into a ditch and killed himself and Marcus and anyone unlucky enough to be behind him. "Sarge," Jimmy said quietly, "I need to stop." Hayes looked at him, really looked at him, saw the bloodshot eyes, the trembling hands, the way Jimmy swayed on his feet like a man standing on the deck of a ship in rough seas. "You want to quit?" "I want to sleep." "You sleep when we get to Paris." "I won't make it to Paris." The words hung in the air between them. Hayes studied Jimmy for a long moment, then glanced back at the convoy. 400 trucks, 400 drivers, all of them as exhausted as Jimmy. All of them are waiting for someone to tell them what to do next. "You know what happens if we stop?" Hayes said softly. "Patton's Third Army is 60 miles east of here. They've got enough fuel for maybe 6 more hours of combat. After that, they're sitting ducks. The Germans regroup, fortify, and we lose the momentum that's going to win this war." Jimmy stared at the ground. "I know. So you tell me birdsong. You tell me how I'm supposed to let you stop when men are dying because we're not there yet." Jimmy didn't have an answer, because there wasn't one. This wasn't about fairness or limits or what a human body could endure. This was about logistics, about fuel and ammunition and the cold mathematics of war. "Get back in your truck," Hayes said. "We're taking the detour." Jimmy turned and walked back to his vehicle, each step feeling like he was dragging chains. Marcus was smoking again, staring out at the river. "Are we turning around?" Marcus asked. "Detour," Jimmy said. 10 miles north. Marcus crushed his cigarette against the dashboard. "Hell with it. Let's go." Jimmy climbed into the cab. "Turn the key." The engine protested, but it turned over. He waited for the truck ahead to move, then eased the clutch out and followed. The detour took them through a village, narrow streets lined with stone buildings, French civilians standing in doorways, watching the convoy rumble past. An old woman held up a baguette, shouting something in French. A little boy saluted. Jimmy didn't acknowledge them. He was somewhere else now, somewhere deep inside his own skull, where the only things that existed were the steering wheel and the road and the truck ahead. They found the second bridge intact. The convoy crossed single file, tires thumping on wooden planks. On the far side, the road opened up into farmland, wheat fields shimmering gold in the afternoon sun. And then Jimmy's engine exploded. Not literally, but close enough. A sound like a gunshot erupted from under the hood, followed by black smoke pouring through the vents. The truck lurched, lost power, and coasted to a stop. "Ah, hell," Marcus said. Jimmy sat there, hands still on the wheel, staring straight ahead. He didn't move, didn't speak. Marcus looked at him. "Jimmy?" "Nothing." "Jimmy? You okay?" Jimmy blinked. Once. Twice. Then he opened the door, climbed down, walked to the front of the truck, and lifted the hood. The third cylinder had blown. Oil everywhere. The engine block cracked clean through, dead. The truck was dead. Hayes appeared at his shoulder. "Can you fix it?" Jimmy stared at the ruined engine. Thought about his father's garage. Thought about the tools he didn't have. The parts that didn't exist. The time he couldn't spare. "No," he said. Hayes nodded slowly. "Then we redistribute your cargo and keep moving. What about me? You ride with someone else. We'll come back for the truck later." Jimmy looked at the vehicle he'd driven for 3 days straight. The torn seat, the worn steering wheel, the engine he'd coaxed and cursed and kept alive through sheer force of will. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Then he turned and walked away. They reached Paris at midnight. Jimmy rode in the back of Corporal Webb's truck, sitting on a crate of rifle ammunition, staring at nothing. Around him, the convoy moved through darkened streets, past shuttered cafes and silent apartments, toward the fuel depot on the eastern edge of the city. The liberation of Paris happened 2 weeks ago. The fighting was over here. But you couldn't tell by looking at Jimmy's convoy, every driver exhausted, every truck battered, every man running on fumes, just like the tanks they were trying to resupply. When they finally pulled into the depot, Jimmy climbed down and stood in the middle of a sea of trucks, breathing in diesel fumes and dust, feeling nothing. "Birdsong!" He turned. Hayes was walking toward him, clipboard still in hand, somehow looking less tired than when they'd started. "Good work out there," Hayes said. Jimmy nodded. Didn't trust himself to speak. "We delivered 512 tons. Patton's boys are already rolling again. You should be proud." Proud. The word didn't mean anything anymore. Hayes seemed to understand. He clapped Jimmy on the shoulder and walked away, barking orders at other drivers, already planning the next run. Because there was always a next run. Marcus appeared with 2 canteen cups full of coffee, both of them steaming. He handed one to Jimmy. "We made it," Marcus said. "Yeah. You think it mattered?" Jimmy took a sip of coffee. It was bitter and burnt, and it was the best thing he'd ever tasted. "I don't know," he said honestly. Maybe the tanks we fueled today punch through German lines tomorrow. Maybe they don't. Maybe some kid from Iowa gets to go home because we got him bullets in time. Or maybe he dies anyway." Marcus stared into his coffee. "That's dark, man. That's war." They stood there in silence, 2 men among thousands, watching the depot come alive as crews began unloading cargo, refueling trucks, and preparing for the next convoy. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled a low, constant thunder that never quite stopped, even here, 60 miles behind the front. Jimmy thought about his truck, abandoned on a road outside Chartres. He wondered if anyone would salvage it or if it would just rust there, another piece of wreckage in a country covered with wreckage. He thought about the drivers who hadn't made it, the men who'd died when their trucks were strafed, the ones who'd crashed in the dark, the ones who'd simply stopped breathing from exhaustion and stress. And he thought about the fact that in 6 hours, Hayes would wake him up and tell him to do it all over again. "I'm gonna find somewhere to sleep," Marcus said. "Yeah, me too." But Jimmy didn't move. He stood there with his coffee, watching the organized chaos of the depot, thinking about roads and bridges and broken engines and the strange, terrible calculus that turned men into machines and machines into the difference between victory and defeat. A staff car pulled up near the depot entrance. An officer climbed out, a lieutenant colonel with shiny boots and a clean uniform, the kind of man who'd never driven a supply truck in his life. The colonel walked over to Hayes, shook his hand, said something Jimmy couldn't hear. Hayes nodded, gestured at the rows of parked trucks. Then the colonel did something unexpected. He saluted. Not the perfunctory salute you give to superior officers. A real one. Slow, deliberate, full of respect. Hayes returned it. Then he turned and called out to the assembled drivers. Listen up. General Patton himself asked me to relay a message. He says the Red Ball Express is the greatest truck convoy in military history. He says you've done more to win this war than any air raid or naval bombardment. He says, without you, the Germans would still be dug in at Normandy. A cheer went up from the drivers, weak, exhausted, but genuine. Jimmy didn't cheer. He just stood there, coffee in hand, trying to decide if that made 3 days without sleep worth it. He still wasn't sure. But when Hayes looked in his direction and nodded, a simple acknowledgement from one driver to another, Jimmy felt something stir in his chest. Not pride exactly. Something smaller, quieter. Recognition, maybe. That he'd been part of something larger than himself. That the road he'd driven mattered, even if he'd never know exactly how much. Marcus nudged him. Come on. Let's get some rack time before they send us out again. Jimmy drained his coffee and followed. September 5th, 1944. The Red Ball Express ran for another 74 days after that first convoy to Paris. Jimmy drove 36 more runs before the Allied supply lines finally stabilized, and regular depots were established closer to the front. By then, he'd crossed France 7 times. He'd survived 11 air attacks, 4 blown engines, and more close calls than he could count. He'd lost friends, men who'd driven beside him one day and were gone the next, buried in makeshift graves along roads whose names he couldn't pronounce. And he'd learned something about war that they didn't teach in training. That victory wasn't just won by generals or infantry or pilots. It was won by mechanics and truck drivers and supply clerks, the men who kept the machinery running when every logical reason said it should stop. In total, the Red Ball Express delivered 412,000 tons of supplies over 81 days. It employed over 6,000 trucks and 23,000 men, 75% of them black soldiers, like Jimmy, serving in segregated units, doing the jobs no one else wanted. They didn't get medals, didn't get parades. Most history books barely mentioned them, but they got Patton to Germany, and that was enough. Jimmy returned to Tuskegee in 1946 after the war ended. He opened a garage on the south side of town, fixing cars and trucks for anyone who needed it, black or white. Sometimes, late at night, when he was alone in the shop with grease on his hands and the smell of oil in his nose, he'd think about those roads in France, about the weight of the steering wheel, about Marcus sleeping beside him in the cab, about Sergeant Hayes and his clipboard and the way he'd saluted the colonel who'd saluted him, and Jimmy would smile, not because the war had been good, it hadn't been, but because he'd driven through it and come out the other side. And somewhere in France, there was a road marked with red balls, where 400 trucks had rolled through the darkness without headlights, carrying the weight of victory on their backs. That road was still there, and so was he.